The gentle morning breeze of New York City entered through the apartment window in Park Avenue, bringing with it the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Joseph Henry observed the city awakening from the 10th floor, his wrinkled hands holding a steaming cup. At 71 years old, his face, marked by time, told stories that words could never fully express. On the living room wall, an old black and white photograph caught the eye. Him, much younger, next to Mary Helen, his first wife, surrounded by 9 smiling children. Next to it, a more recent photo showed his current family. Betty, his second wife, her 3 children whom he had embraced as his own, and the same 9 children from the first photo, now adults, some already with their own children. "Grandpa, tell that story again?" The sweet voice of his granddaughter Julie, 8 years old, interrupted his thoughts. She was sitting on the couch hugging a teddy bear, her eyes shining with curiosity. Joseph Henry smiled, placing the cup on the coffee table. "Which story, my love? The one about the day you saw Grandma Mary Helen after she had already gone to heaven?" The elderly man's heart quickened slightly. Even after so many years, the memories of that day remained as vivid as the moment they happened. He sat down next to his granddaughter, adjusting his glasses on his face. "You know, Julie, there are things in this life that we can't explain with our little heads. They're mysteries as big as the universe itself." The girl snuggled closer to her grandfather, preparing to hear the story that fascinated her so much. At that moment, Betty entered the room, drying her hands on her apron. She paused for a moment, observing the scene with a smile on her lips. "It was an afternoon like any other," Joseph Henry began, his voice taking on a solemn tone. "I was in Dr. Paul's office doing my routine checkups. I had just turned 60 and had been feeling some chest pains. As he narrated, the memories of that day began to flow like a rushing river. The sudden and intense pain in his chest, the panic in the doctor's eyes, the rush of the nursing team. But what came after? That was something that would change his life forever. Suddenly, it was as if I was floating, Julie. I could see my body down there, lying on the stretcher, the doctors trying to bring me back. But I wasn't afraid. It was such a deep, profound feeling of peace." Betty approached silently, sitting in the armchair nearby. She knew that story by heart, but she still got emotional every time her husband told it. She saw in his eyes the special sparkle that appeared when he talked about his extraordinary experiences. "That's when I saw a light," he continued. "But it wasn't just any light, it was as if it was made of pure love, if you can imagine such a thing. And within that light there were 2 people, 2 angels actually. They smiled at me and asked if I wanted to continue or go back." "And why did you come back, Grandpa?" asked Julie, even though she already knew the answer. Joseph Henry looked at Betty, his eyes moist with emotion. "Because I still had a mission here, my love. There were still people who needed my love, my presence, and that's when I received a special blessing, something that completely changed the way I see life." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the narrative. It was Sunday family lunch day and the first guests were starting to arrive. Mark, his oldest son with Mary Helen, came in accompanied by his wife and 3 children. Soon after came Paula and Richard, Betty's children, bringing more grandchildren and treats for lunch. The house filled with voices, laughter, and hugs. Joseph Henry observed that scene with his heart overflowing with gratitude. How could he explain that every moment, lived after his near-death experiences, had a different flavor, a more vibrant color? Julie was still there by his side, reluctant, to join the other children who were already playing on the balcony. "Grandpa, are you afraid of dying?" The question, so direct and profound, made all the nearby adults stop their conversations for a moment. Joseph Henry smiled, caressing his granddaughter's hair. "No, my love. When you know what exists on the other side, you understand that death is not an end. It's just a passage to something even more beautiful. But while we're here, we need to live each moment with all the love we can." The afternoon followed its natural course, with the family gathered around the abundant table, sharing stories, memories, and dreams. Joseph Henry, seated at the head of the table, observed each face, each smile, each gesture. In his heart, he held the certainty that his greatest mission was precisely this: to be a bridge between 2 worlds, showing that love is the only force capable of transcending all barriers, even that of death. That night, after everyone had left and the house returned to silence, he sat again by the window. The city lights twinkled like earthly stars, reminding him of the divine light that had once enveloped him. He had so much more to tell, so many experiences to share, but each story had its right moment to be revealed. The morning was beginning to dawn on the New York City horizon when Joseph Henry woke up startled. He had dreamed again of that day, more than a decade ago, when he had his second near-death experience. The dream was so vivid that his heart was still racing, and drops of sweat were running down his forehead. He got up slowly, trying not to wake Betty, who was sleeping peacefully beside him. He walked to the apartment balcony, observing the first lights of day painting the sky in pink hues. The streets were still quiet, except for the occasional noise of a lone car or the singing of early birds. It was exactly on a morning like this, he murmured to himself, recalling the events of that fateful day. It was 2012, and he was admitted to Mount Sinai Hospital for a seemingly simple surgery. During the procedure, there was an unexpected complication, and that's when it happened. His second journey to the threshold between life and death. "Dad?" The voice of Anna Claire, his youngest daughter with Mary Helen, brought him back to the present. She had arrived the night before to spend a few days with them, and used to wake up early like her father. "Good morning, my flower," smiled Joseph Henry, opening his arms to receive his daughter's hug. "You had that dream again, didn't you?" Anna Claire knew her father well enough to know when he was immersed in the memories of that transformative experience. Joseph Henry nodded, looking back at the horizon. "You know, daughter, every time I dream about that moment, it seems I discover something new, a detail I hadn't noticed before." Anna Claire took 2 cups from the cupboard and started preparing coffee for both of them. The familiar aroma filled the kitchen, bringing comfort to that morning conversation. "Tell me again, Dad, what was it like to meet Mom there?" Joseph Henry closed his eyes, letting the memories flow. "It was as if I was crossing a veil of light. Suddenly I wasn't in the operating room anymore, but in a different place. It wasn't exactly a physical place as we know it. It was more like a dimension of absolute peace and love." He paused to take a sip of the coffee Anna Claire offered him. "And that's when I saw her. Your mother was there, but not as we saw her, in her last days. She was radiant, young like on our wedding day. Beside her were your grandparents, my parents, all looking happy and at peace." Anna Claire held her father's hand, feeling the emotion in his voice. "And what did Mom say?" "She smiled in that unique way of hers, you remember? Anne said that I could stay if I wanted to, but that there was still something important for me to do here. That's when I noticed a more distant presence." At that moment, Betty appeared in the kitchen, wearing her favorite blue robe. She approached, silently, not wanting to interrupt that moment between father and daughter. But Joseph Henry extended his hand, inviting her to join them. "When I approached that presence," he continued, "I realized it was Jesus Christ. He wasn't like the images we see in churches. He was such an intense, loving light that I could barely look directly at him. And then he asked me that question that changed everything. 'Where is your heart?'" "And what did you answer, Dad?" asked Anna Claire, even though she already knew the story by heart. "I couldn't answer immediately. How could I? It was a much deeper question than it seemed. That's when he started showing me things. The creation of the world, the fall of Lucifer, the purpose of each soul that comes to earth." Betty gently squeezed her husband's hand, offering silent support. She knew how much those memories moved him. "The most impressive thing," continued Joseph Henry, "was seeing your mother, Anna Claire, continuing her spiritual work. She was helping other families, connecting loved ones through genealogical work. That's when I understood that our purpose doesn't end when we leave this plane." The sun was already high in the sky when they finished breakfast. Anna Claire needed to prepare for an online meeting, and Betty had her daily commitments. But before they dispersed, Joseph Henry shared one more thought. "You know, after that experience I understood that there is no real separation between this world and the other. It's all a continuation, a constant flow of love and learning. And every person we meet, Every experience we live is part of a larger plan that we can't always fully understand. That morning of confidences and memories would mark the beginning of a special week in Joseph Henry's life. He didn't know it yet, but the universe was preparing another extraordinary experience that would help him understand his mission in this earthly plane even better. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, as Joseph Henry was organizing old photographs in his apartment study. It was Ryan, his 25-year-old grandson, Mark's son. The young man's voice was trembling, different from his usual cheerful tone. "Grandpa, I really need to talk to you. Can it be today?" There was something in Ryan's voice that made Joseph Henry feel that familiar tightness in his chest, an intuition he had developed after his experiences between the two worlds. "Of course, my son. Do you want to come here to the house?" 2 hours later, Ryan was sitting on the living room couch, his restless hands betraying his anxiety. The young doctor, recently graduated, had always been the most skeptical in the family when it came to his grandfather's spiritual experiences. "Grandpa, something happened yesterday during my ER shift, something I can't explain." Joseph Henry served his grandson a glass of water, sitting down beside him. The late afternoon painted the room with orange hues, creating a welcoming atmosphere for that conversation that promised to be deep. "We had a patient, a lady about 80 years old. She had a cardiac arrest and during resuscitation was technically dead for almost 4 minutes. Ryan paused, taking a sip of water. "When we managed to bring her back, she started describing everything that had happened in the room. Details she couldn't have known, Grandpa, including a conversation I had with the nurse on the other side of the room far from her." Joseph Henry felt his heart quicken. He knew exactly what his grandson was experiencing, that first contact with something that challenged all his scientific training. "But that's not all," continued Ryan, now with tears in his eyes. "She said she met Grandma Mary Helen. She described her exactly as she was, talked about the birthmark she had on her neck, said she sent a specific message for me." "And what was the message, son?" She said that Grandma said she's proud of my choice for medicine, but that I need to learn to see beyond what the eyes can see. How could she know that I always wanted to have known Grandma, that I always wondered if she would approve of my choices?" Joseph Henry got up, walking to an old jacaranda wood dresser. From a drawer he took out a diary bound in brown leather, its pages yellowed by time. He sat down again next to his grandson, carefully opening the diary. "Your grandmother wrote this 2 weeks before the accident," he said, showing a specific page. "She had premonitory dreams, you know. In this entry, she described a dream where she saw one of her yet unborn grandchildren becoming a doctor. She wrote, 'I saw a boy with green eyes like mine, with Mark's smile, saving lives with his hands and his heart.'" Ryan took the diary with trembling hands, recognizing the delicate handwriting he only knew from old cards and documents. His eyes, green like his grandmother's whom he never met, went over the words several times. "Grandpa, how do you do it? How do you manage to live with one foot in each world?" Joseph Henry smiled, a smile full of wisdom and understanding. "They're not two separate worlds, Ryan. It's all one thing, a great web of connections that we can't always see. Your experiences at the hospital, my visions, your grandmother's dreams, they're just different windows to the same truth." At that moment, Betty arrived from the supermarket, bringing bags and the smell of fresh bread. Seeing her grandson crying, she dropped everything in the kitchen and came to the living room. "Did something happen?" "A miracle happened, Betty," replied Joseph Henry, his eyes shining. "Ryan just received his first message from the other side." The news of Ryan's experience at the hospital spread quickly through the family. The following weekend, Joseph Henry's house was fuller than usual for the traditional Sunday lunch. Everyone wanted to hear the young doctor tell his story firsthand. The aroma of beans with rice and roast chicken filled the house as the family settled in the spacious living room. Ryan, still visibly impacted by recent events, was surrounded by curious cousins, uncles, and nephews. "So you really think it was real?" asked Paula, Betty's daughter, holding her 6-month-old baby in her arms. Ryan adjusted himself on the couch, seeking the right words. "As a doctor, I've always been trained to look for scientific explanations for everything. But what happened that night? There's no rational way to explain it." Joseph Henry observed the scene with a mixture of joy and nostalgia. Seeing his family gathered, openly discussing spiritual experiences, made him remember his own journey of discoveries. "Dad," called Anna Claire sitting beside him, "I remembered something Mom always said before she passed. She talked about a special notebook where she wrote down her dreams and visions. Is it the same one Ryan saw?" The old man nodded, getting up to fetch the diary again. "Your mother had a special gift, daughter. She not only dreamed about the future but understood the messages she received." When he returned with the diary, everyone fell silent. Joseph Henry opened to another page, different from the one he had shown Ryan. "Listen to this," he said, adjusting his glasses. "March 15th, 1995, 3 days before the accident. I had a different dream today. I saw our children grown up. I saw grandchildren yet to be born. I saw Joseph with another love, a woman with a generous heart, who will take care of our family as if it were her own. I don't feel jealousy or sadness. I only feel gratitude for knowing that love has many forms and that our family will continue to grow." Betty, who was in the kitchen, stopped at the door upon hearing those words. Her eyes filled with tears as she exchanged a meaningful look with her husband. "There's more," continued Joseph Henry, turning the page. "I also saw a place of light, so beautiful that words cannot describe. I know I will soon know this place, but I'm not afraid. From there, I'll be able to continue taking care of everyone in a different way." The silence that followed was dense with emotion. It was Julie, the 8-year-old granddaughter, who broke it with the typical innocence of children. "Grandpa, did Grandma Mary Helen know she was going to die?" Joseph Henry closed the diary gently, pulling his granddaughter onto his lap. "Not exactly, my love. She had a special connection with the spiritual world, received warnings and guidance, but the most important thing is that she taught us not to be afraid of death, because it's just a passage." Mark, who had been quiet until then, cleared his throat. "Dad, there's something I never told you. The night before the accident, I woke up with Mom sitting on the edge of my bed. I was 15 years old. She hugged me tight and said that no matter what happened, she would always be with me. At the time, I didn't understand, but now—" The conversation was interrupted by Paula's baby's cry. Betty announced that lunch was ready, and the family began to move towards the table. While helping to serve, Joseph Henry noticed something different in the environment. It was as if a soft and loving energy enveloped everyone present there. During lunch, the stories continued. Each family member had some experience to share: significant dreams, inexplicable coincidences, feelings of presence at important moments. It was as if Ryan's revelations had opened a door, allowing everyone to feel safe to talk about their own spiritual experiences. "You know," said Joseph Henry as they served dessert, "when I had my first near-death experience, one of the things I learned is that we are all connected by bonds that go far beyond this life. Each person here has an important role in this great web of love and learning." Ryan, who had been quiet and thoughtful throughout lunch, finally spoke. "Grandpa, that patient. She also said something about an important project I should start at the hospital. Something related to the spiritual welcoming of terminal patients." Joseph Henry's eyes lit up. "And what do you think about that idea?" "At first I thought it was crazy. But now, after all this, I'm starting to think that maybe it's exactly what I need to do." Fall was coming to an end in New York City, bringing with it that characteristic mix of temperatures that so confused New Yorkers. On the Monday following the family lunch, Joseph Henry woke up feeling something different in the air. It was a familiar sensation, one he had experienced twice before, a mixture of deep peace and expectation. He decided to keep his normal routine. He went to the bakery, bought fresh bread and fruit, chatted with Mrs. Carmen, the florist on the corner, and returned home. Beatrice had left for her volunteer work at the hospital, where she coordinated a storytelling project for hospitalized children. As he prepared his breakfast, Joseph Henry felt a slight dizziness. He leaned on the kitchen counter, breathing deeply. The sensation was different from the other times. There was no pain, just a growing lightness that began to take over his body. "It's time," whispered a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Before he could react, He found himself again in that familiar state. He was outside his physical body, observing himself sitting at the kitchen table. But this time something was different. The environment around him began to transform, the walls of the apartment dissolving into a golden and welcoming light. "Welcome back, Joseph Henry." The voice was familiar. As he turned, he saw Jesus Christ, exactly as he had encountered him in his second experience. At his side was Helen Marie, more radiant than ever, and a figure he immediately recognized. His mother, Mrs. Elizabeth, who had passed away when he was still young. "My son," said Mrs. Elizabeth, approaching with a smile he had never forgotten, "you have done beautiful work." "But there is still more to be done," added Helen Marie, her gaze overflowing with love. Jesus Christ stepped forward, and all the light seemed to concentrate in his presence. "Joseph Henry, do you remember the question I asked you in our last encounter?" "Where is your heart?" he replied, feeling the same emotion as years ago. "And now do you know the answer?" Joseph Henry reflected for a moment. The last few weeks had been intense. Ryan's experience at the hospital, the revelations from Helen Marie's diary, the increasingly strong union of his expanded family. "My heart is where it has always been," he finally answered. "In love. In the love that unites our family, that transcends death, that heals and transforms." Jesus smiled, and in that smile was the light of 1,000 suns. "And that's why you're here again. The time has come for a new mission." The environment around them began to change again. Joseph Henry saw himself transported to various places simultaneously: hospitals, nursing homes, family homes. In each location, there were people facing the moment of passage between worlds. "Observe," said Helen Marie, now at his side. "Each transition is unique, but all are sacred. Some souls depart in peace, others in confusion. Some surrounded by love, others in solitude." Mrs. Elizabeth added, "Your grandson Ryan received the first call. Now it's your turn to help him build a bridge." "A bridge?" asked Joseph Henry, observing the scenes unfolding before him. "A bridge between medicine and spirituality," explained Jesus, "between the care of the body and the welcoming of the soul. Ryan has the medical knowledge, you have the spiritual experience. Together, you can help many souls in this crossing." The vision expanded, and Joseph Henry could see the future. A project at the hospital where Ryan worked, a space where terminal patients and their families would receive not only medical care, but also spiritual welcoming. He saw his grandson, coordinating a multidisciplinary team, saw himself sharing his experiences with grieving families, saw lives being transformed. "But remember," warned Jesus, "free will is sacred. You can show the way, but each one must choose whether or not to follow it." Helen Marie approached, gently touching his face. "Tell our family that love never dies. It only changes form, like water that transforms into a cloud, but remains water. And tell Marcus," she added with a maternal smile, "that I really was sitting on the edge of his bed that night. Some bonds are so strong that not even death can break them." Mrs. Elizabeth stepped forward. "Son, your mission is just beginning. Every experience you've had, every pain, every joy, every loss, and every new beginning, everything was preparation for this moment." Jesus raised his hand in a gesture of blessing. "It's time to return, Joseph Henry. Take with you the certainty that love is the most powerful force in the universe, and that each small act of love has the power to transform lives." The light began to dissipate gently, and Joseph Henry felt himself being gently pulled back to his physical body. When he opened his eyes, he was again sitting at the kitchen table. The coffee in the cup was still hot, as if only seconds had passed. The small cafe in Central Park was practically empty that Wednesday morning. Ryan arrived first, choosing a discreet table at the back of the establishment. He had been anxious since receiving his grandfather's message the day before. "Joseph." Henry entered a few minutes later, carrying an old leather folder under his arm. His face had a serene, almost luminous expression that Ryan had already learned to recognize as a sign that something extraordinary had happened. "Good morning." "My boy," greeted Joseph Henry, sitting down. "Order a strong coffee because what I have to tell you will change your life." While they waited for the coffees, Joseph Henry began to recount his most recent spiritual experience. Ryan listened attentively, occasionally making notes on his cell phone. When his grandfather got to the part about the project at the hospital, the young doctor let out an exclamation of surprise. "Grandpa, this is incredible. Just yesterday, the hospital board sent out a memo asking for proposals for new humanized care projects." Joseph Henry smiled, opening the folder he had brought. "There are no coincidences, Ryan. Look at this." From inside the folder, he removed several yellowed sheets of paper. They were Helen Marie's notes dated more than 20 years ago. "Your grandmother began writing about a project like this long before she passed. She saw a place in the hospital where medicine and spirituality walked hand in hand, where people could find comfort for both body and soul." Ryan took the notes reverently, again recognizing his grandmother's handwriting. The pages described in surprising detail a project very similar to what he himself had begun to imagine in recent weeks. "But how are we going to implement this?" "Grandpa, the healthcare system is so rigid, so focused only on physical treatment. That's where your generation comes in, son. You have more open minds. You can see beyond the traditional limits of medicine." Joseph Henry paused, taking a sip of coffee. "Besides, we're not alone in this mission." As if to confirm his words, Ryan's cell phone vibrated with a message. It was from Dr. Hannah Sorensen, head of the hospital's palliative care department. "She wants to see me today," said Ryan, surprised. "She said she had an idea for a project, and my name came to her." "Mind." Joseph Henry laughed softly. "See? The threads are connecting, the fabric is forming." They spent the next 2 hours drafting an initial outline of the project. Ryan contributed with his medical knowledge and hospital experience, while Joseph Henry added elements based on his spiritual experiences and Helen Marie's writings. "Let's call it Project Bridge," suggested Ryan after much thought, "because that's what we want to create, a bridge between two worlds, between science and spirituality, between life and death." When they finally said goodbye, Joseph Henry hugged his grandson for a long time. "Your grandmother is very proud of you, Ryan, and so am I." On the way home, Joseph Henry made a stop at St. Patrick's Cathedral, where he used to go to meditate. He sat on a bench at the back, observing the light coming through the colored stained glass windows. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing he was heard. "Thank you for allowing me to be part of this greater plan." At that same moment at the hospital, Ryan was entering Dr. Hannah Sorensen's office. The doctor, a lady of about 60 years old, received him with a warm smile. "Ryan, I'm so glad you came," she said, indicating a chair. "I had a very vivid dream last night. In it, a very kind lady showed me a project to humanize the care for terminal patients. When I woke up, your name was very clear in my mind." Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine. "By any chance, did this lady in your dream have a birthmark on her neck?" Dr. Hannah's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" The young doctor smiled, taking out of the folder the outline of the project he had just created with his grandfather. "It's a long story, Doctor. A story that began a long time ago with an extraordinary woman who continues to care for our family, even after passing." In the living room of Joseph Henry's apartment, Helen Marie's diary was open on the coffee table. On the visible page, a phrase seemed to shine under the afternoon light. "The greatest miracle is not avoiding death, but understanding that it is only a transformation. When people understand this, fear will turn into acceptance and pain into learning." Dr. Hannah removed her glasses, wiping away a discreet tear. "That's exactly what we're witnessing here. A paradigm shift." Suddenly, they were interrupted by a nurse who rushed into the room. "Dr. Ryan, the patient in 514, Mrs. Margaret, she's asking for you." Ryan stood up immediately. "Grandpa, can you come with me? I think the time has come." Together, they headed to room 514. Mrs. Margaret, a 92-year-old lady, was lying in her bed, surrounded by family members. Her face, although pale, conveyed a surprising serenity. "Dr. Ryan," she whispered, "I can see them. They're all here. My parents, my husband John, they look so beautiful." Ryan gently held her hand, while Joseph Henry remained at the foot of the bed, in silent prayer. The room was filled with a different energy, almost palpable. "Don't be afraid," said Mrs. Margaret, looking at her children who were crying silently. "It's so beautiful, so full of love." Those were her last words. She passed away serenely with a slight smile on her lips. Later on the way home, Ryan drove in silence, processing the day's events. Joseph Henry broke the silence. "You know, something special happened in that room today." "Yes, Grandpa. For the first time I didn't feel like I lost a patient. I felt like I witnessed a sacred passage." Joseph Henry smiled, looking out the car window at the starry sky. Project Bridge is doing exactly what it should, showing that there is no real separation between worlds, only different ways of existing and loving. That night when he got home, Joseph Henry found Beatrice on the balcony, contemplating the illuminated city. He hugged her from behind, sharing the warmth of his body and the gratitude in his heart. "Bea," he whispered, "I think I finally understood why I went through all those near-death experiences. Each one of them was a preparation for this moment, to be able to help other people understand that death is not the end, it's just a transformation." Beatrice turned in his arms, looking into his eyes. "Helen Marie knew this, didn't she? That's why she left all those notes, all those recorded dreams." The auditorium of St. Francis Hospital was packed that Saturday morning. Project Bridge was completing 6 months of existence, and a special lecture had been organized to share the results and experiences. In the front row, Joseph Henry was seated between Beatrice and Anna Claire, his heart overflowing with emotion. Ryan took the stage with a confidence his grandfather had never seen before. At his side, Dr. Hannah Sorensen smiled proudly. The EI. Lights dimmed, and a presentation began to be projected on the screen behind them. "Good morning, everyone," Ryan began. 6 months ago, we started a journey that many considered impossible, to create a space within a traditional hospital where medicine and spirituality could walk hand in hand. Images of the project began to pass on the screen, patients in moments of peace, families gathered, the team in action. In one of the photos, Joseph Henry appeared talking to a group of people, his face illuminated by the natural light coming through the window. "The numbers speak for themselves," Ryan continued, presenting graphs and statistics. Significant reduction in anxiety and depression levels among terminal patients, decrease in the use of painkillers, improvement in the quality of life of families. But it was the video testimonials that really touched those present. Family. Members sharing how the project had transformed their relationship with death and grief. Patients describing profound spiritual experiences. Healthcare professionals reporting changes in their way of seeing medicine. In the audience, Joseph Henry felt a familiar presence. He looked to the side and for a brief moment saw Helen Marie sitting next to him smiling. It wasn't a frightening vision, it was comforting, like a long-awaited embrace. "And today," announced Ryan, reaching the end of his presentation, "I am pleased to announce that Project Bridge will be expanded. The hospital board has approved the creation of an entire wing dedicated to integrative care, where the spiritual and physical will be treated with equal importance." Enthusiastic applause filled the auditorium. Joseph Henry noticed tears in the eyes of several people present, including his own family. After the lecture, as people gathered for a coffee reception, an elderly lady approached Joseph Henry. Her face seemed vaguely familiar. "You don't know me," she said, "but you knew my husband, John Charles. He passed away 3 months ago, here at the hospital." Joseph Henry remembered immediately. John Charles had been one of the first patients in the project, a gentleman who faced terminal cancer with admirable serenity. "He asked me to give you this," the lady continued, holding out an envelope. "He wrote it on the eve of his passing." With slightly trembling hands, Joseph Henry opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in neat handwriting. "Dear friend, when you told me about your near-death experiences, I confess I had my doubts, but now on the brink of my own passage I understand everything with a clarity I never imagined possible. Last night I had a special visit. Your Helen Marie was here along with my mother and father. They showed me that death is not an end, it's a new beginning, and they asked me to tell you something important. The circle is almost complete. I don't know exactly what this means, but I felt it was important to pass on this message. Thank you for helping make my passage lighter and more meaningful. With gratitude, John Charles." Joseph Henry sat down, feeling the weight of those words. The circle is almost complete, he murmured to himself. Suddenly, an understanding began to form in his mind. He looked around the hall. He saw Ryan talking animatedly with other doctors. He saw families sharing experiences. He saw hope in the eyes of patients who previously only showed fear. Project Bridge had become much more than a simple hospital program. It was the materialization of a dream that had begun decades ago in Helen Marie's visions. Beatrice approached, noticing his contemplative expression. "Is everything all right, love?" "Yes," he replied, carefully putting away the letter. "I'm just starting to understand something very important. I think we'll have more revelations soon." At that moment, Ryan came to them radiant. "Grandpa, you won't believe it. Dr. Hannah said she had a dream last night with Grandma Helen. Marie, she said we need to prepare because something extraordinary is about to happen." The night was exceptionally starry in New York City, a rare phenomenon in the metropolis always covered in clouds and pollution. Joseph Henry was alone on his balcony, contemplating the sky when he felt that familiar sensation of transcendence approaching. This time, however, something was different. "Don't be afraid," said a soft voice behind him. It was Helen Marie, more radiant than ever, accompanied by a golden light that didn't dazzle the eyes. "I'm not afraid," he replied, smiling. "In fact, I was expecting you." Helen Marie approached, and for the first time since she had started appearing in his visions, she sat down beside him. "The circle is almost complete, Joseph. Do you know what that means?" Before he could answer, the environment around them began to transform. The apartment balcony gave way to an ethereal space where past, present, and future seemed to coexist in perfect harmony. "Look," said Helen Marie, pointing to different scenes that formed around them like three-dimensional movie screens. In the first scene, Joseph Henry saw himself much younger on the day he met Helen Marie. In the second, the birth of each of his children. In the third, the accident that took Helen Marie. Then, his encounter with Beatrice, the birth of his grandchildren, each of his near-death experiences, until reaching the present and Project Bridge. "Each moment was carefully planned," explained Helen Marie. "Each pain, each joy, each loss, and each achievement. Everything was part of a greater purpose. The project at the hospital? Not just that," she smiled. "The project is just a part. The true mission is much greater." The scenes around them changed again, and Joseph Henry saw something that made his heart race. There were hundreds, thousands of people, all connected by threads of golden light that intertwined, forming a complex and beautiful web. "These are all the lives that have been and will be touched," explained Helen Marie. "Each person who goes through Project Bridge carries with them a seed of understanding. This seed grows, blooms, and touches other lives." Joseph Henry marveled at how the web of light expanded, reaching people in different places, different situations. "It's like a domino effect of love," he murmured. "Exactly," agreed Helen Marie. "And now the time has come for the last piece to fit." "Which piece?" "Your choice, Joseph." At that moment, a greater presence made itself felt, and Jesus Christ appeared before them as radiant as the last time, but even more welcoming. "Joseph Henry," he said with his voice that seemed to come from all directions, "do you remember the question I asked you so many years ago?" "Where is your heart?" replied Joseph Henry, "and now I know the answer with even more certainty. It's in the love that connects all worlds." Jesus smiled. "And that's why you're here again. The time has come for your final choice." Helen Marie gently took his hand. "You have already fulfilled your earthly mission, Joseph. Project Bridge is established, the seeds have been planted, and now they have a life of their own. Ryan and the team will continue the work masterfully. You can choose to stay," Jesus continued, "and continue your work for a few more years. Or you can come with us now and continue helping from another plane, as Helen Marie has been doing." Joseph Henry felt a deep peace invading his being. He looked at the scenes that were still unfolding around him, his family, the project, all the lives touched and transformed. "Can I say goodbye?" Jesus nodded. "Of course. The choice is yours, and you will have the time you need to make it. The vision began to gently dissipate, and Joseph Henry found himself back on his balcony. The sky remained exceptionally starry, and now he knew that an important decision awaited him. Sunday dawned with a different clarity in New York City. It was as if the light itself had a special quality, more golden and welcoming than usual. Joseph Henry woke up before the sun rose and found Beatrice already in the kitchen, preparing lunch. "You're different today," she said, observing him carefully. "You had another vision, didn't you?" He smiled, hugging her from behind as she chopped vegetables. "Yes, my love, and today I'm going to share everything with the family." Gradually, the apartment filled up with the arrival of children, grandchildren, and in-laws. Ryan was one of the first to arrive, bringing with him a special energy. He had just come off a shift at the hospital where 2 Project Bridge patients had made especially serene transitions. When everyone was gathered in the living room, there were more than 30 people between adults and children, Joseph Henry asked for silence. The buzz of conversations gradually ceased, and all eyes turned to him. "My beloved family," he began, his voice clear and firm. "Last night I received a very special visit. Helen Marie came to me along with Jesus Christ to make me an invitation." A deep silence settled in the room. Even the younger children seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Throughout all these years, through my near-death experiences, I was prepared for a mission. Project Bridge was part of that mission, but not all of it. The true purpose was to show all of us that love transcends all barriers, even that of death. Beatrice held his hand, her teary eyes understanding even before he continued. "Yesterday I was given a choice," Joseph Henry continued. "I can stay here for a few more years, or I can depart now, peacefully and consciously, to continue the work from another plane, as Helen Marie has been doing." Anna Claire sobbed softly, and Mark hugged her. Ryan kept his eyes fixed on his grandfather, a deep understanding in his gaze. "And what was your choice, Dad?" asked Paula, her voice trembling slightly. Joseph Henry smiled, a smile so full of love that it seemed to illuminate the entire room. "I chose to depart, but not today, not now. I chose to have this moment with you, so that you understand that it's not an end. It's a transformation." To everyone's surprise, there were no cries or protests. Instead, a feeling of understanding and acceptance began to fill the environment. "When?" Beatrice asked softly. "Tonight," he replied, "after everyone has left, after a day of celebration and love." The lunch that followed was different from any other that family had ever shared. Stories were told, memories relived, laughter and tears mixed naturally. Joseph Henry made sure to have a special moment with each person present. With Ryan, he talked about the future of Project Bridge. "You don't need me anymore, son. Now, the project has a life of its own, and you have all the wisdom necessary to lead it." To Beatrice, he handed a letter to be read later. "You were a gift that life gave me, a love that taught me that the heart can always expand." As the day progressed, a golden light began to fill the apartment. Only Joseph Henry could see the presences that began to materialize in the corners of the room. Helen Marie, his parents, friends who had already departed, all waiting patiently. When the sun began to set, the family started to say goodbye. They weren't sad farewells, but full of love and understanding. Each hug was a "see you later," not a goodbye. Finally, only Beatrice and Ryan remained in the apartment. Joseph Henry sat in his favorite armchair on the balcony, contemplating the first stars that began to appear in the sky. "It's time," he said softly. Ryan, using his medical experience, confirmed what he already knew. His grandfather's heart was slowing down. Naturally, without pain or discomfort. "Grandpa, I can see," Ryan whispered, tears of joy in his eyes. "I can see Grandma Helen Marie. She's here, isn't she?" "Yes, my son. And it's not just her. We are all united in this moment." Beatrice held one of Joseph Henry's hands, while Ryan held the other. A golden light filled the balcony, and for a moment they could all feel the presence of divine love that enveloped them. "Now I understand completely," were Joseph Henry's last words, a serene smile on his lips. "Love is the circle that never breaks, that unites all worlds, and in it there is no separation, only different ways of being present. His heart stopped gently, like a song that comes to the end of its last note. At that same instant, Ryan and Beatrice felt a wave of love and peace so intense that they couldn't contain smiles among the tears. At St. Francis Hospital, all the patients in Project Bridge reported having significant dreams that night. Dreams of light, of love, of understanding. Joseph Henry's legacy continued, now in a new form. And so the circle was completed, not as an end, but as a new beginning. For in the great fabric of divine love, each story is just a thread that intertwines with infinite others, creating a pattern of eternal beauty that transcends all worlds and all dimensions.